Our last speaker will present us a little more of context and the bigger picture here in thinking about this transition point and others that followed. Philip Deloria is a former trustee of this museum. He is currently the Carroll Smith-Rosenberg Collegiate Professor, and he has also the longest title of anyone today. I just want you to settle in here. The Carroll Smith-Rosenberg Collegiate Professor in the Departments of History and American Culture and the program in the Environment and the program in Native American Studies at the University of Michigan. I'm kind of joking, but it's a reflection of what a capacious and imaginative scholar Phil Deloria is, and how widely esteemed he is both at the University of Michigan and afterwards, and elsewhere. His topic this afternoon is Indians Loom Larger, Indians and America at the Turn of the Century.
Well, you've now heard the disclaimer about repetition 4 times, and you'll see a few of the same images and maybe a few of the same thoughts. But as Fred said, I'm going to try to take a somewhat kind of 30,000-foot perspective, maybe a little bit on this. And I think it's particularly interesting in relation to Ruth's really quite wonderful talk, complicating Frank Speck and complicating the whole nature of salvage ethnography. Because I'm at that 30,000 feet thing, it'll be useful for you, I think, to sort of juxtapose some of the generalizations that I'm going to make with some of the specifics that you've heard earlier on. So my assignment today, not an easy one from my point of view, is to try to serve as a sort of overview thing, or perhaps a mirror to Steve Kahn's opening presentation. He framed the Museum of the American Indian as in relation to the culmination, right, or the culmination of ideas and practices long established over the course of the 19th century and earlier. And then we've considered in a series of deeper dives some of the very particular practices of collecting, organization, and conceptualization that constituted the museum of which we are today a legacy. So my task is to consider this broader picture, not where the museum came from necessarily or how it developed its work, but kind of more about what it meant, how those meanings spoke to and of the cultural world of the early 20th century, that moment of modernity that is, I think, so hard to really understand. And then to think a little bit about what legacies it may have left behind. Cultural meaning and practice is one broad terrain, and you don't get there easily. So my strategy is to consider, in fairly abstract terms, 3 particular categories that we've also heard a bit about today: objects, institutions, and ideologies. Now, objects contain culture, often in eerie ways that are not easily parsed. As they move through different cultural contexts, their sometimes static quality reveals a great deal about the meaning-making actions that human beings wrap around them. Institutions offer the structures through which we can see the operations of what we might call culture industries: collection, curation, display, marketing, each of which says something about how objects take on cultural meanings. Ideologies offer us powerful, deceptive, interested banks of ideas and beliefs that urge us to play with the contradiction between what we actually do and how we would like to think about and talk about the things that we are doing. As Louise Althusser once described ideology, an imagined relation to the real conditions of our existence. In this sense, ideologies are not just beliefs, they are material practices, and they take shape in museum buildings, collections, databases, exhibits, and more. They too are the evidence of culture, and in fact, they're the things that get us talking at that larger kind of scale. So what were the objects of the MAI? We know them well. Well, okay, we know them pretty well. Well, we know them kind of through the collections of the MAI, or the NMAI, the collection and catalog architecture of correspondence, bills of sale, index cards, labels, and databases. They are things like woven blankets, clay pots, masks, adornments, canoes, woven baskets, ritual and ceremonial gear, boxes, parfleches, and we could go on and on. These objects were created in specific cultural contexts. Some were deeply private, and we are abashed today when we see how the process of the museum has made them unexpectedly public, how far it has taken them from the context of their creation and use. Others were made for trade, meant to function as commodities to be sold to collectors, tourists, and yes, museums. Many were personal. Others were not owned at all, but were the collective property of societies, families, and other groups. Not a few of the objects in the NMAI collection sit unsteady in relation to those categories. Indian craftspeople might make a ceremonial object, a personal object, a gift, and a commodity at the same sitting. Perhaps not at the same sitting, but within the same sort of kind of universe of possibility and craft. I've framed objects in relation to the context that surround them, but I've also called them static. I use this interesting, or at least to me, interesting word that sort of popped into my head. What I mean to evoke with that word is the curious fact that objects are also imbued with a kind of life of their own. As Walter Benjamin observed, they have auratic power, the power to return your gaze, or perhaps in George Heye's words, they offer vistas and dreams into the worlds of people who created them. They don't simply reflect your world back at you, though they do that, but they also exude some essence of their own world. I suppose that not all objects have such power, but I know that many of them do. And that is one of the reasons we continue to found and to build and to visit museums, to experience time and space through objects. A long dead or far distant human being held this object, made this object, which now sits before me in my time and place. One of the few real continuities with the historical past or with other places. Theodor Adorno once imagined a linguistic connection between museums and mausoleums. The latter were, he suggested, the homes of dead objects. And if one focuses on the vanished meanings that once situated an object in its original context, then perhaps he was right. But I think it is just as powerful to suggest that as objects migrate as cross-cultural cargo, they can also take on an excess of life. Not one life, but many lives. Their intrinsic static life, their auratic life, and the new lives granted to them with each new context they enter. The museum is both their seemingly final context, that is, as a museum object, not likely to be going anywhere else, and a place of new context as they are situated and resituated in new constellations as we develop exhibits around them, loan them, put them in other places, use them as community resources to speak with and engage American Indian people. We could name many different kinds of objects, but for the sake of simplicity, and as part of this crude exercise in categorization, let me suggest 5 categories that I think come zooming at us from the 19th century through the collecting activities of George Gustav Heye and his museum. Curiosities. Curiosities, there we go. The impulse of 18th century collectors and later exhibitors to find and possess objects that shock and defamiliarize, that lift the viewer into a state of, well, curiosity about a wide and partially unknown world. The curiosity, one might say, was an artifact of the colonial expansion of the European world across space. Fetishes. A new kind of curiosity suited to the moment of modernity, and therefore not quite the same as the curiosity. Rather, the fetish offered collectors and viewers an opportunity to travel through conceptual time, retrieve meaning from those primitives seen as outside the temporal world of modernity, and return from the trip with a small token of the treasure of the authentic. Salvage, a variant on the fetish, but given its meaning through the consolidation of academic knowledge taking place in institutions such as the Modern Museum, the Just Forming Research University, the state agency, or the kind of dedicated amateur such as we've seen already in the case of Heye. Aesthetic objects, in which collectors framed objects anew as art objects, things to be gazed at and contemplated for form, line, expression, emotional evocation, and universality. And because each of these categories created objects as things of desire, they also created as objects as things to be valued, priced, bought, and sold. They became, in a word, cargo. Each generated distinct kinds of collecting activity, even as objects themselves floated across those categories. And I think it's interesting to think about some of these, if I'm really sort of going to sort of riff on the commodification of objects, I think it's useful to see this in the terms that Karl Marx would have seen it as moments of what he would have called primitive accumulation, right? Blunt force acquisition of capital, right? That is then redeployed in other kinds of ways. So from the mass-produced tourist good to the most private funerary object, the legacy of the moment of the museum, I think, is this constellation of overlapping meanings and values, old and new, that were attached, reattached, constantly negotiated and navigated with objects in the early 20th century. So how do we make sense of those meanings? We could do worse than to consider the institutional structures through which objects, money, knowledge, and other forms of cargo passed. The museum offers a powerful focal point for such consideration. Through it, we can trace chains of commodification and flow. Objects passed, as we've seen, from indigenous people to individual freelance collectors, and then to the museum. They passed to military officers who doubled as amateur ethnographers, and then to the museum. They passed to trading post operators, swapped as pawned goods in a transitional barter market economy, who then traded them to museum collectors. They passed through curio dealers who formally commodified them, and then to museums. They passed from Indian people to the leaders and workers of more formal collecting expeditions. The passages of objects to institutional locations happened in many ways. Some were given, some were sold. Not a few were simply taken by force or deception. Some were offered with the hope that they would be in some kind of custodial care, perhaps temporary custodial care. Others shed because their owners had altered their own belief systems. Others alienated under conditions of deprivation. So add up these institutions. George Gustav Heye was one of many collectors, the descendants of earlier founders of cabinets of curiosities and things like that. When he converted his collection into the Museum of the American Indian, it became one of many museums, as we've heard. At the smallest end, local historical societies across the country collected what they saw as the remnants of an indigenous past that spoke to the specifics of their own local histories, often importantly being constituted in these kinds of moments. In universities, anthropology departments were in the early moments of professionalization. And indeed, the early 20th century saw the rise of the modern research university, as Steve Kahn pointed out. Research universities assembled all kinds of archives and collections to support a wide range of work. Herbariums, arboretums, plant, animal, insect collections, comprehensive libraries, historical archives. The ethnographic collection was part of an institutional imperative to build collections in support of the knowledge that would constitute academic disciplines. And at the high end, of course, one found the federal efforts, the Bureau of American Ethnology and other Smithsonian collections that defined the very nature of the knowledge institutions created in the 19th century. And of course, those institutions then competed with one another in various forms of knowledge production and ownership. At the same time, a network of market institutions established mechanisms for the flow of objects from Indians to various kinds of markets and of these institutions. Curio dealers and trading posts both acquired and commissioned Indian-made objects. Department stores sent buyers to the dealers and, when possible, straight to Indian craftspeople. Other institutions, including Indian schools, looked to produce for this market as well, and non-native companies began the mass production of Indian objects. One of the most interesting things in the correspondence of my great aunt, Ella Deloria, are moments where she's buying non-native made, mass-produced objects, which she then, at wholesale, which she then resold as retail goods to people for whom she was performing, lecturing, talking on American Indian kinds of subjects. So it's not simply the case, I want to say, that sort of the mass production of Indian objects didn't also have certain interesting points of articulation with Indian people themselves. As Elizabeth Hutchinson and others have detailed, a domestic aesthetic built on Indianness led early 20th century white women to assemble objects in the so-called Indian corners of their homes, and white men, as Ruth just pointed out, to build their own kind of hobby collection dens. These were discrete displays of blankets, pottery, beadwork, images, and objects. These market networks were part of larger practices that created, displayed, and communicated cultural meanings. They told people how to think about themselves and their world. In New York's Hotel Astor, The basement restaurant was made over in 1905 as a great Indian hall. Campfire girls and Boy Scouts promulgated child-raising philosophies made visible through the creation and adornment of Indian objects. By the teens and 1920s, the American Museum of Natural History had linked its ethnographic collections to an effort first proposed by Arthur Wesley Dow in 1915 to create a distinctly American design based on indigenous pattern. The Indianist composers, Charles Wakefield Cadman and Thurlow Lawrence, among many others, tried to craft an American music based on indigenous song, which had been often collected by some of the very same people gathering up ethnographic objects. In the Southwest, tourist infrastructures, the railroads, the automobile routes, the archaeological experience tours offered Eastern visitors a taste of Indian authenticity. And of course, artists and writers retreated to Taos to capture what they saw as mysterious intangibles attached to Indians. These are only a few quick examples. Indians loomed large in fin de siècle culture. They showed up in Wild West shows, early films, novels, and expositions and collections on the athletic field and the newspaper column, in music and art and design. Their images and objects passed through and constituted a range of institutional structures. They were, in fact, everywhere in the ways that people were thinking and talking at this point in time. And we might then ask, why? What value and meaning did they carry for this conversation, this cultural conversation? Well, institutions and the objects that pass through them help us to see the distinct nature of a number of ideological formations. Each part of the overall operations, the complicated operations of American society and culture at the turn of the century. There's no way to capture all of these, to delineate their internal subtleties, to unpack them in the time that we have. This is the subject of books and things like this. But in the interest of big categorization, let me offer 6 blunt ideological formations, some old, some new, some in transition, all negotiated and navigating contradictions as heuristic categories for us to think with about this particular moment in time. So first, aboriginality, right? The understanding that Indian people, the continent's rightful and original inhabitants, had effected a graceful handoff of Aboriginal status to their successors, European immigrant colonizers, who were now themselves of the continent and had to understand what that meant, right? The sort of claim to actually become the Aboriginal, the indigenous, which is characteristic of so many settler societies. The vanishing Indian / manifest destiny complex. A persistent understanding, on the one hand, that it was God's will that Americans rule the continent, that God just really, really wanted Americans to be everywhere there. And it's a sort of parallel or partner, that it was a law of nature rather than aggressive conquest that explained the mysterious disappearance of Indian peoples. You would move into the West and you would find their still warm campfires and hear the rustling of leaves as they sort of flittered off into the, right? Nobody had anything to do with it. It just kind of happened. Indians sort of vanished. The social evolution race complex. A shifting understanding that played on the ideas that Indians were, on the one hand, capable of progressing through social evolutionary stages and assimilating into American society and indeed into American modernity. And on the other hand, the counterclaim that they were racially distinct, incapable of social change, unassimilable, and therefore marked for inevitable disappearance. These things are constantly at play with one another. Although, as Fred has actually shown, the sort of rise of the discourse of racialization as we head into this moment is actually a really important part of this history. Violence and pacification. So transitional kinds of ideological formations that played between older beliefs in innate Indian violence, that Indians were insurgents to be dealt with as exceptions to the rule of law, and thus required what amounted to, in the late 19th century, total warfare, America's sort of first experiments with total warfare. That, and the post-frontier belief in the reality of total conquest, and therefore the utter pacification of Indian people, that they had been so pacified you can go and live right next to them and they no longer posed a danger. This opened up all kinds of possibilities for material and concrete interactions with Indian people. salvage and nostalgia, relying on, I think, a very firm understanding that there was a kind of an epochal difference, right, framed around the supposed closing of the frontier and the end of military resistance, this sort of rise of a cultural sensibility of regret and what Renato Rosaldo once called imperialist nostalgia, right, an immediate longing for the people and events that one has displaced. One linked consequence of this was the anthropological impulse, complicated, to save and salvage indigenous objects, not simply here, but across the globe. And finally, authenticity and anti-modernism. As people who figure, and have always figured, a kind of qualitative difference, Indians offered those who questioned modernity a powerful trope. If modernity was inauthentic, if it was not spiritual, if it was sort of riven by commodity relations, then authenticity was to be found in Indian people, their objects, their spirituality, their barter economies, their distance from the city and from modernity, those kinds of things. So pick an object and follow it. I just picked this from the NMAI site because it's such a lovely thing. Follow it from the context and use for which it was created, and there are lots of possibilities then in thinking about that, into the institutional locations that gave it meaning, and there's lots of possibilities for that. Art, ethnography, commodity, fetish, knowledge, object, point of competition. Add up those possibilities, and we can start to see the complexities and contradictions of this kind of cultural moment that we're in. We can track objects, collecting practices, institutional locations as manifestations of these ideological formations. So when you thought Indian in the early 20th century, your head pinged with a set of delicious, evocative, dangerous kinds of meanings about being American, about finding meaning in the modern world, about confronting, forgetting, and periodizing your history, about making sense of racial politics, about saving, collecting, preserving, and learning from the traces of indigeneity that remained. The anthropologist and the collector and others salvaged that cargo in part in order to build authority in linked and contesting institutions, the museum, the state, the university. These were some, and I have to imagine not all, of the ideological and cultural context in which George Gustav Heye built the collection that would then become the core of the National Museum of the American Indian. It's easy to situate Heye and others of his generation in a number of critical contexts. It was too easy for them to assume Indian disappearance and therefore fail to see actual Indian people struggling to stay afloat, or maybe even to give them a hand, as Frank Speck seems to have done. It was romantic of them to fixate on nostalgia and authenticity over the realities of past and present. They were wrong in seeing the late 19th century as a marker of some kind of epochal change. Each of those assumptions structured cultural thought and practice over the course of the 20th century and continue in American collective consciousness today, and oftentimes, usually, not to good effect. Right? I've spent some part of my scholarly career unpacking those assumptions and critiquing them, legitimately, I'd like to think. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are affirmative arguments about this moment. Not simply that these people created collections that today constitute important legacies and points of engagement with American Indian communities, presents, and futures. That's easy, and it's true, and it's important, and it's fundamental to the museum. But rather that these folks were, in fact, also onto something, right? That Indians loomed large in that moment for good reasons that are hard to perceive today, not easy to perceive. That those collectors and founders, despite the imbalance in power relations that often work to native disadvantage, were committed, perhaps more than some of their fellows, right, to a kind of cross-cultural dialogue that also had the possibility or the potential to be revelatory and transformational. Now, for the most part, we think about the ways it was revelatory and transformational for them, but I think it also had possibilities to flow both ways. So in that sense, they also laid down the template for the institutions that followed, including the National Museum of the American Indian. The mission of this museum, both to bolster the world of Indian country and to communicate and educate the non-Indian world about Native American histories, identities, and issues, and to do so through its collections, owes a kind of conceptual debt to the world of George Gustav Heye. not simply in terms of the formation of the collection, though that, but in terms of a long and important history of engagement, tentative, uneven, self-interested, utopian, clueless, productive, forward-thinking, odd, that cross the lines of social and cultural difference. Thank you so much.